And I'll try not to take up any time at all other than to tell you that our next guest is excellent, and his name is Dr. Stephen Fritz. And I will turn over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Warren. I appreciate that. As the other speakers so far we've had today have all started with thanks to Warren for inviting them to speak. And I, too, must thank Warren for inviting me to speak here at this conference. Although I must say, after the first 2 days, we've had wonderful talks on Tennesseans at war and Knoxvillians and the contribution of Knoxville to the war effort. And then yesterday had splendid talks on Churchill, various different aspects of Churchill, from Alan Packwood, obviously, who's not here, Richard Toy, Warren himself. You can see from the title here, I feel a little bit like an interloper here, like I'm Daniel walking into the lion's den or something. I'm going to give you I'm going to be the bad guy today. I'm going to give you the perception from the other side. As you can see, this attack will decide the war. German planning for D-Day. I say German planning. It's really Hitler. My talk is based on my last book, The First Soldier, Hitler as Military Leader, which was an attempt to reassess Hitler as a military leader. So some of what I'm about to say might strike you as odd. I like to say odd things, I guess, just to stir up people. But Hitler, I think, was maybe considerably different in terms of his military perceptions than kind of the received wisdom will hazard here. So let me see if I can get going. And okay, yeah, that actually works. Wow. Again, and I always, as I said, I always seem like I'm upsetting the apple cart, as it were, to use another cliche. But I studied the Eastern Front of World War II. I studied the German war in the East, and in fact have written basically three other books on the German war in the East. So that's kind of my preoccupation. Some would say, my wife would say, my obsession, I suppose. But it's hard for us to understand that from the invasion of the Soviet Union, from the German invasion of the Soviet Union in late June 1941 up until really the end of 1943, the summer of 1943, I guess I'll say the summer of 1943, the Western Front was largely inconsequential to Hitler. Hitler and German military planners spent very little time thinking about the Western Front. It was more of a potential problem than an actual problem, and it only entered their consciousness at times like Alan Packwood mentioned yesterday, the Dieppe parade in August 1942. That was significant for the failure on the Allied part, but it was also significant because it's one of the first times that it raised in Hitler's mind, in German military planners' mind, the possibility of an imminent or a more imminent second front. But then again, the failure of the Dieppe raid and the disaster at Dieppe confirmed Hitler and German planners in their confidence that Western Europe was relatively safe from any sort of imminent invasion. Hitler was preoccupied with the war in the East. He thought the war in the East would decide the outcome of the war. That retained until the spring and summer of 1943. And the spring and summer of 1943, obviously, we've had the failure of Operation Barbarossa, the original attack in 1941. We've had the failure of the second effort in the summer of 1942, the second great German offensive in the summer of 1942 towards Stalingrad. Now Hitler, and again, despite the general perception, Hitler was very realistic about what that meant. What that meant from his perspective was he was very fully conscious he could not win the war as he had originally anticipated winning the war. But there was a big difference between winning the war the way you originally perceive it and losing the war absolutely. There's a great continuum in there. And Hitler perceived in the spring and summer of 1943 the purpose of the Kursk Offensive, which has gotten much press over the years, when you get past all the hyperbole, the Kursk Offensive was actually rather limited in scope, rather limited in intention, as opposed to the invasion of 1941, which was on an 1,800-mile wide front. Imagine that, an 1,800-mile wide front. In the second offensive in the summer of 42 covered the entirety of Army Group South, which is about a 750-mile front. Kursk was a very limited operation, which was designed only to squeeze in a Russian salient, destroy a few Russian armies, hopefully from Hitler's point of view, stabilize the Eastern Front, and perhaps in his ultimate ideal, I suppose, situation, ultimately that would allow for perhaps peace negotiations with Stalin. And again, whenever I bring up the idea of peace negotiations with Stalin, it seems incredible. But of course, Hitler and Stalin had made a peace once before in August 1939. And at least from the late summer of 1941, German and Russian negotiators had been meeting on a fairly regular basis in Stockholm, Sweden, to discuss the possibility of a peace on the Eastern Front. So it's entirely possible if the Germans had once again battered up the Russians in a summer offensive and destroyed a few more Russian armies. After all, Hitler thought the Russians have to run out of manpower sooner or later. Eventually, the Russians will have to make peace. That would allow him to transfer the great bulk of his troops to the west before there was a large-scale Allied presence in northwestern Europe. The Allied invasion in Italy had long since bogged down. So from Hitler's point of view, the situation wasn't too bad if he could win this successful Kursk offensive, and that would stabilize the situation, which might allow for an acceptable way out of the war for him. And of course, we know that, to fast forward here, we know that the Kursk offensive failed. So now, by the autumn of 1943, the situation reversed. Hitler still thought it was possible, perhaps, Hitler still thought it was possible, perhaps, to stabilize and stalemate the war, but now the fronts were switched. Now it would have to be success in the West would have to stabilize the front in the East. So now, for the first time since before this German invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler now gave priority to the Western Front. And you can see Hitler conferring with some of his generals there. His famous Führer Directive number 51, issued on 3 November 1943, for the first time since the invasion of the Soviet Union, gave precedence to the war in the West. Hitler realized any successful Anglo-American invasion would immediately imperil German military production. The great concentration of German industry in the Ruhr was in far western Germany. So any successful Allied invasion would immediately put enemy forces 150 miles away from the greatest concentration of German industry. So that was in the forefront of his mind. He ordered an immediate upgrade of French coastal defenses, as you can see on the 20th of December 1943, in a situation conference with his military leaders. He said straight out, there's no doubt that the attack in the West will come in the spring. It is beyond all doubt. This attack will decide the war. If you look, and again, I'm going to say something here, it sounds perhaps kind of odd. At the end of 1943, when Hitler is now looking to the West, the situation is serious, but to use an old Austrian joke, the situation is serious, but it's not desperate. Again, from Hitler's point of view, from the view from Berlin, there were elements within which it seemed that the overall military situation could be stabilized at a point which was still favorable to Germany, and it still might be possible for Hitler to wriggle out of the war with his regime intact and with some of his conquests intact. So the Eastern Front seemed to be stabilizing. After all, winter is now approaching, and the experience of the previous 2 winters indicated that the level of operations would drop off. The Allied advance in Italy, as I said, had stalled out south of Rome. The British had been unable to break German morale through a repeat of the devastating Hamburg firestorm of July 1943. In fact, unacceptable losses had forced the Americans to suspend daylight bombing operations in the autumn of 1943. American bombers were losing so many bombers, and more importantly, we were losing so many of the important personnel the highly trained men who were every B-17 or B-24 shot down over Germany, you were losing 10 to 12 highly trained airmen. We could not sustain that. So the American Air Force actually suspended daylight bombing operations over Germany in October 1943, so which gave the Germans some reason to believe that they could defeat the bomber offensive. At the same time, in terms of defeating the bomber offensive, Albert Speer had reorganized weapons production. There had been a devastating British bomber offensive in the spring and early summer of '43. The Germans called it the Ruhr Offensive, in which the British had targeted the industrial establishment of the Ruhr. That had devastated German production for a brief time, but Speer now had reorganized the German war economy, and so German production was skyrocketing. And they now, for the first time in years, were producing large quantities of tanks, of artillery. They had enough weapons now to equip new divisions in the West. The synthetic oil production, synthetic fuel production had peaked. They had stocks of what am I trying to say? Output of fighter planes had risen enormously. Despite increased resistance activity, the continent was stable. Again, we tend to mythologize resistance to the Nazis. The view from Berlin was considerably different. From Berlin, there was no particular problem. They didn't perceive any particular problem, any instability. There was no risk. The top Nazis did not perceive any risk to their rule in occupied Europe. It was just not there. So there was no threat of any particular threat of a large scale uprising in Europe. The construction of the Atlantic Wall had been accelerated, and especially under Rommel, there had been now energetic efforts were being made to prepare defenses, especially at Normandy. Hitler had high hopes for the technologically advanced V weapons, the V1s, V2s. There were actually V3s, V4s. There were advanced ocean-going submarines under development. So everything at the time, in that brief moment in time at the end, say November 1943, there appeared to be a path forward for the Nazis, for Hitler, to stabilize, to stalemate the war, if you want to put it that way. So, as I say, the task from Hitler's point of view, the goals were clear, the objectives, the task was clear: to stalemate the Soviets, to continue to stalemate the war in the East, to defeat the bomber offensive, and continue to accelerate arms production, to unleash the V weapons in the new submarine offensive, especially the submarines. If they could break the supply line between North America and Great Britain, that would make any invasion, as Alan Packwood said yesterday, that would make any invasion very, very problematical. So there were factors that the Nazis, that Hitler thought were favorable, and that might develop favorably in the future. And of course, above all, the most important thing was to defeat the Anglo-American invasion here. Let me see if I can get this. Okay. Essentially, and again, it sounds kind of odd to our ears, I guess, since we know what happened and we know the outcome of history. The hardest thing for any historian is to put out of your mind what happened, and to try to envision the possibilities as if you don't know what was going to happen. So Hitler actually considered the invasion a great opportunity. I hate to say he was looking forward to it, but if you look at his conversations with his intimates, he was fairly optimistic. And he was kind of impatient for the Allies to get on with it, so that so the German forces could defeat the invasion, and that would turn the situation around. Hitler believed, like most of his military advisors, that Germany could not just stand on the defensive and try to stalemate the war that way. They had to win some sort of significant, tangible victory. And they had to win the significant, tangible victory, first of all, to let their enemies understand that you might still be able to defeat Germany, but the cost is going to be enormous. And do you want to do that? Do you want to go ahead and lose massive numbers of lives, simply in order to defeat me. And secondly, Hitler always understood that the alliance between the enemy alliance was always, from his reasoning, an unnatural alliance. After all, as Hitler said time and again, you had the leading capitalist nations and you had the leading communist nation in alliance. The only thing that held the alliance together was their antipathy to Hitler. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, Hitler always thought that this unnatural alliance would sooner or later break apart. So his reasoning about defeating the Anglo-American invasion, excuse me, would be it would essentially pry that alliance apart. The invasion itself, and again, as Alan Packwood had mentioned, we tend to take for granted the success of the invasion, and he did a wonderful job yesterday in pointing out exactly how risky this was. A very, very complicated endeavor, and the odds were, at the time, were probably more in favor of failure than success in this operation. After all, the Allies, if you think about it, the Anglo-Americans had not been particularly good at amphibious invasions. There was the invasion of North Africa, which was largely unopposed. That was okay. But Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was a near disaster, at least on the American part. Salerno wasn't much more impressive. Salerno, again, American forces were almost driven back into the sea at Salerno. Anzio was a complete disaster. Where was the string of success? Where was there anything to indicate to the Germans that the Anglo-Americans are splendid at this and they're just going to roll over us and we should just basically give up now? Everything in the previous Allied experience indicated to the Germans that they were defeatable. And an Anglo-American invasion of northwestern Europe in Normandy was going to be much, much, much more complicated and difficult than anything the Allies had attempted so far. So Hitler was fairly confident, especially with the new Panther and Tiger tanks that were coming online. He had transferred a few units of the Panzer units to the west. Hitler thought that he could pull off a second Dunkirk. Goebbels, in his diary, Goebbels was an avid diarist. Goebbels records over and over in his diary how Hitler was in the spring of '44. Hitler was in a good mood. He was quite confident that the Germans could defeat the invasion, that they could impose a second Dunkirk, that the German public, in fact, was expecting an imminent end to the war when Germany proved successful here. Essentially, what Hitler was gambling on that was success in defeating the invasion. That would, he thought, promote a severe political crisis in Great Britain. Hitler also prided himself on being an historian. He was an avid reader of history. He actually he had quite a sophisticated understanding of history. And he looked to a recent example to provide hope for him, Gallipoli in World War I. The Gallipoli invasion had failed. That had cost who else? His job in the government, Winston Churchill. It seemed kind of symmetrical for Hitler there. It seemed kind of a good omen for him. He thought that this abortive landing would cause a severe crisis of morale in Great Britain. There was a general belief in Berlin that British morale was very brittle. Again, as Alan Packwood had mentioned, there was not exactly a long litany of British military success against Germany in World War II. There was the failure in France, the humiliation of Dunkirk. The British had been evicted from Greece in the spring of '41. There was the humiliation of the German airdrop on Crete, which had taken the island of Crete from the British. There were successive failures in North Africa. It's not until late 1942 there at El Alamein that finally you get this first great success. So it's not like there was this long succession of British triumphs. So the Germans tended to believe that morale in Great Britain was fairly brittle. So one more disastrous failure, a second Dunkirk, might be enough to cause the British in their wildest dreams to cause the British to suspend their military operations and basically just sit tight. If that happens, what's the American response going to be? Hitler and German planners assumed that American leaders would then see the obvious, that it would not be possible to launch another second front in Europe for another year at least. So American forces in the interim might be transferred to the Pacific theater. Again, after all, we tend to forget that at the time the American public was more invested in defeating the Japanese than we were in defeating the Germans. It was the political elite that wanted the Europe first approach. Most of Americans were much more emotional. It was the Japanese who had bombed Pearl Harbor. It was the Japanese who had plunged us into war. There was a fairly limited understanding, I think, for the Europe first approach. So it would not have been terribly difficult for Roosevelt and the American military simply to switch the operations to the Pacific. If that happens, then you have kind of in Hitler's reasoning, and if that happens, then you have the add-on effect, the knock-on effect. What's Stalin going to be thinking? Stalin, by this time, by early 1944, Stalin has recovered most of former Soviet territory, but he's done so at a horrendous cost to the Soviet Union. Eventually, it's estimated, now the conservative estimate, of course, is about 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives in World War II, as opposed, to give you a sense of comparison, about 420,000 Americans, as opposed to 27 million Soviet citizens. Even as bloodthirsty and bloody as Stalin was, he had to be thinking, at what further cost? Can I count on my Western allies? Stalin was inherently distrustful, innately distrustful of British and American leaders. Can I trust my Western allies to do something to help me? If they're defeated in this invasion attempt, when will they try again? Will they try again to invade? If that's the situation, would it not be better for me? Would it not be a wiser situation for me just to make peace with Hitler? I've got most of the Soviet Union back. I can make peace with Hitler, even if it's a temporary peace. I can make peace with Hitler, rebuild my army, and sometime in the future prepare again. If the British and Americans want to defeat Nazi Germany, well, let them do it. They can go ahead and invade without my help. So it changes the whole calculus here in terms of the perceptions. So German planning was fairly straightforward again, based on the earlier experiences. Excuse me. German planners concluded that the landing, the approach and the initial landing offered the best possibility of defeating the enemy. So this, of course, meant that strong coastal forces, strong military forces had to be stationed in the coastal areas and put on a constant state of readiness. Hitler also thought it was important for an immediate reaction on the beach, as he kept talking about nailing the Allies to the beach. If we can just nail the Allies to the beach, he said at one of his conferences, for 6 to 8 hours, and then we can send the German panzer forces hurtling onto the beaches, and that will defeat the invasion. So the key thing always in Hitler's mind was to pin the initial invasion force on the beach. Excuse me. Of course, Hitler anticipated that by the time of the Allied invasion, the new German jet fighters, that was one of their miracle weapons. They anticipated that German jet fighters would be available and ready and deployed out in France as well, and that would help contest aerial superiority. All of this depended, of course, rapid response depended, of course, on knowing where the invasion was going to come. And those of you who know something about this know that German military intelligence was kind of an oxymoron. The Germans didn't really have much military intelligence. For as good as the Germans always are assumed to be at the art of war, German intelligence gathering activities were always woefully inadequate. In fact, in the German military tradition, they devoted very little effort or prestige to intelligence gathering. That was always regarded as kind of a secondary, grubby sort of operation. So the Germans didn't have a whole lot of intelligence coming out of Great Britain as to where the operation might come. In fact, at a January conference, January 1944 conference, Hitler, in dramatic fashion, said, where will the enemy land? Where will he land? Where are the clairvoyants? But then from February on, any number of conferences from February on, and Hitler was a map person. He loved big maps. Hitler would walk to the map and he would turn to his generals and he would point. He'd say, here's where the invasion's coming, right here. And he would point right at Normandy, right at the landing beaches. This is where the invasion's coming. He was very confident of that. In fact, on a couple of occasions in April and May of 1944, when Field Marshal Rundstedt, who was the overall commander-in-chief in the West, tried to limit defensive preparations in Normandy or tried to shift preparations elsewhere, Hitler overruled him and said, no, the invasion's coming right here. We have to prepare the defenses right here. So that essentially provides the justification, I suppose, the rationale for the Atlantic Wall. And the Atlantic Wall, again, you can see the construction. So if I point in the right direction, the construction rubble here, inspecting some of the fortifications of the famous Atlantic Wall. As you all know, the Germans were good at propaganda. Goebbels was a phenomenal propagandist, so they made the Atlantic Wall out to be this great, massive, impenetrable fortress, which it never was. It was actually the reality of the Atlantic Wall largely consisted of thinly manned bunkers and fortifications. It was nowhere the gigantic, impenetrable fortification of German propaganda. Essentially, what the Atlantic Wall represented was a modification of German strategy here. They had long since, German military planners had long since realized that their initial assumption was faulty. There was no possible way Germany could contest the Allied invasion fleet as it was coming across the Channel or as it initially landed. And there was no way the Germans could contest this for the most obvious reason in the world. The Germans had no Navy or Air Force. So it's impossible to contest the landings in their initial phase because the Germans simply did not have the ability to do that. Their Air Force was, it was pitiful on the ground out there in France. They had very, very, very few aircraft. So the Atlantic Wall essentially was designed to make up for this deficiency. So what the Atlantic Wall was designed to do was not stop the Allies. It was not designed to defeat the Allies. It was simply designed to hold them up for a while. The great majority of troops manning the Atlantic Wall, the stationary defenders, were made up overwhelmingly of second and third rate, actually even fourth rate German troops. There was only one infantry division in Normandy which the Germans even rated halfway capable of any sort of activity other than stationary defense. Virtually all of the infantry units the Germans had in Normandy were rated as second, third, or fourth rate troops. The great majority of them were rated satisfactory only for stationary defense. That meant they could not carry out any sort of activities or mobile defense. They were just rooted to where they were, and that was that. It's also, some of you probably know, it's also true that the great majority of German troops at Normandy were considered to be over age. They were convalescent troops. Many of them had medical problems. And a large number of them actually were not even German. They were ethnically non-German. There were some Poles. There were large numbers of Russians. There were other Eastern Europeans at the Normandy in these infantry divisions. So the goal of these the goal of the Atlantic Wall, the goal of these stationary defenders, and you know, I guess it is kind of cruel here, they were essentially cannon fodder. They were simply there to be an impediment, to slow down the Allies simply long enough to allow the German panzer forces, and the Germans did have superb panzer forces there. They were relying on their panzer troops. The stationary forces would muck the thing up for a while. The Allies would be stalled on the beaches, and then the panzer units could come into action there. So that was the basic goal there. The problem here, the problem was not that the German generals, there's a certain dispute here. The problem was not over anything I've said so far. All the Germans agreed on this. The problem was how to use the panzers. And what's interesting here is personal experience. Rommel, of course, who had led the great panzer charge of the 7th Panzer Division in France in 1940, but then had commanded in North Africa. Rommel was the one German commander who had deep, thorough experience of what it meant to fight a battle when the Allies had complete aerial supremacy. In North Africa, Rommel had gotten accustomed to, he understood what it meant not to ever have any sort of aerial cover from his own forces. He understood that the absolute Allied aerial dominance meant that German mobile forces would not be able to move at daytime. They would be limited only to nighttime movement. It would be very difficult to bring in supplies, reinforcement, all of the rest. Of course, these are the things that a mobile strategy depends on. So Rommel's take from that, he drew the lesson that given the obvious absolute aerial supremacy of the Allies, the important thing was to have the panzer units stationed as close to the beaches as possible. So at the first report of Allied forces coming ashore, the panzer forces will move immediately before the Allied air forces have a chance to interdict them. So his perceptions were shaped by his experience. His adversary, his rival, you can see Rommel here on the left, and on the right here is Field Marshal Rundstedt. There was a command problem because they're both field marshals, which meant they were largely equal in rank, except Rundstedt was commander-in-chief and Rommel only commanded an army. But they both had equal access to Hitler, so you can figure that caused problems too. Rundstedt, along with the commander-in-chief of the Panzer Forces West, a general named Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, they favored the classic Wehrmacht strategy of forming the panzers into a central reserve and then allow the invasion force to come ashore. It'll be weakened by the Atlantic Wall defenders, but the invasion force will come ashore, let the Allies come ashore, let them even build up some of their forces, and then you launch a devastating counterattack that will destroy the great bulk of Allied forces. And that will really cause a disaster for the Allies. Rundstedt, of course, had commanded in France in 1940, and he had been commander of Army Group South in Ukraine in 1941. Both times when the Germans had experienced aerial supremacy on their part. So Rundstedt had never conducted a battle where he did not have aerial supremacy. Schweppenberg was a veteran of the Eastern Front, but he was a veteran of the Eastern Front at a time when the Germans largely had aerial supremacy in the East. So he had not experienced the difficulties of fighting with Allied aerial supremacy. And what's interesting, and this ultimately points to the whole complete German dilemma, Rundstedt and Schweppenberg also pointed to another problem. They had studied the failure of the Germans to defeat the Allied invasion at Salerno, and they had decided that Salerno, the problem was Allied naval guns. the big guns of Allied battleships and cruisers, destroyers coming up close to shore, that had blasted away. This had been prevalent, at least in the American landing in Sicily as well, where much of the major damage had been done by naval vessels. So their argument also included that assessment. Well, here in Sicily and in Salerno, American and British naval ships, naval gunnery had done considerable damage to our panzer forces. So it would be smarter to withdraw the panzer forces out of range of the longest naval guns, which was about 18 miles. And so then they're out of danger from the naval guns, and then they can launch their counterattack. So you can see here the dilemma. The worst part of the dilemma, I suppose, is there was no resolution to the dispute. Eventually, Hitler settled the dispute. The dispute was never really resolved. But Hitler's initial decision was that 3 panzer divisions would go to Rommel, 3 would go to Rundstedt, and the remaining 4 he would control in his own reserves. As I said, the logical argument could be made for either approach to confronting the invasion here. The problem was that the dispute was never really resolved, and part of that was Hitler's indecision. Part of it was that the dispute was unsolvable, and the dispute was unsolvable precisely because of what Rommel understood. The absolute dominance of Allied air and naval supremacy meant that no matter what the Germans did, they were damned. If they tried to bring their reserves to the rear and concentrate them, then of course they would fall prey to Allied aerial attacks. If they brought them up close to shore, of course they would fall prey then again to Allied naval vessels and naval attacks. The biggest problem here was in terms of simply something the Germans could not overcome. They simply were too weak. They simply did not have sufficient quantities of highly qualified, highly trained manpower. They didn't have the equipment. They didn't have the numbers of aircraft to challenge the Allies. That's essentially what they I mean, that was the central dilemma at Normandy here once the invasion began. The larger, and I'm trying to put this into context here, the larger German dilemma was, even as the Normandy invasion was taking place, Hitler could perceive that all of his larger assumptions were proving false. And if you remember back at the end of November 43, there were certain assumptions that if everything fell into place, might offer that way out, a path forward for the Germans. But in point of fact, they were unable to stabilize the Eastern Front. They were unable to stabilize the Eastern Front simply by a quirk of nature. The winter of 1943-44 was unusually warm in southern Russia. So the massive snows didn't come. The cold weather, the unusually cold weather didn't come. So the Russians just kept attacking the whole winter of 1943-44, just steadily pushing the Germans back. So they weren't able to stabilize the front, and which meant that they weren't able to transfer large numbers of manpower and armored units from east to west. In fact, at a crucial point, Hitler was forced to transfer the 2nd SS Panzer Corps from Normandy back to Russia. Hitler had counted on the 2nd SS Panzer Corps as being the key armored unit which would destroy the Allied invasion. In May of 1944, he had to transfer it back to Ukraine to stop the Russian advance in Ukraine, which it eventually did, but it wasn't in Normandy where Hitler had intended it to be to stop the Allied advance. That was one of those I guess after the fact, Hitler rued that fact ever after. He always came back to that. If only the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had been at Normandy, then things would have been different. Well, it's kind of like an armchair quarterback, I suppose, after the fact here. The Allied, let me get back to my thought here. The introduction of the long-range P-51 Mustang, of course, allowed the fighter escort of American daylight bombers over Germany, which meant that the Americans could resume the daylight bombing of the German war industry. The Allied bombing then, in fact, impeded the implementation and the deployment of the V weapons. The V weapons, Hitler had intended that the V1s, V2s, and the long-range submarines would be in operation by the time of the Normandy invasion. The V1s were delayed until just after the invasion was the first V1 attack. V2s were delayed a little bit longer. The long-range submarines never did get into operation because of systematic Allied bombing of German construction facilities. The long-range submarines, which were in fact quite sophisticated, they never did get into operation. They were still testing in the Baltic Sea when the war ended. So again, it's one of those what ifs. If without Allied bombing, you can see how all these things kind of fit together here. And of course, the most important thing, they were unable to defeat the Normandy invasion. So Hitler slept in. You've all heard the great Hitler slept in and other myths, as I like to call it. I say Hitler slept in. Hitler didn't sleep in. Hitler had adopted a pattern of working, which was actually very similar to Stalin, interestingly enough. They both did the same thing. They both inverted night and day. So they worked most of the night and they slept. Hitler would typically work until about 2 or 3 in the morning, and then he would go to bed, and he would rise about 11 o'clock in the morning. And so there was this big myth that, well, Hitler was sleeping and his commanders on the spot were afraid to wake him, and so that's what caused the failure. No, if only it had been that easy, I suppose. The biggest thing, and it's interesting, is that the timing of the invasion caught the Germans by surprise. Not the target, not the area, but the timing. The Germans had expected the invasion in May. I mean, and when it was originally planned for May. But the long stretch of good weather in May, and there was very, very good weather in May in northern France there, the very long stretch of good weather in May, and there was no invasion, caused the Germans to grow a little bit complacent. Then, as I'm sure you all know, the first few days of June were horrible, terrible weather. And the Germans had lost their long-range weather forecasting station out in the North Atlantic, so they had no way to know what the weather patterns were coming in. So with this evident bad weather, the Germans had concluded that the Allies would not launch the invasion here in early June. So, of course, famously, Rommel had gone back to his home in Swabia for his wife's birthday. German intelligence had picked up some possibility of an imminent invasion, but it was either discounted or reported incorrectly, or in some cases, it wasn't even reported to higher authorities at all. German commanders on the spot didn't even bother to send the information up the chain of command. Ironically, not only was Rommel back in Swabia, but most of the top German commanders on the spot were en route to war games exercises in Normandy. And of course, what they were war gaming was response to an invasion. And so as the invasion's taking place, they're on the way to a wargaming conference on what do we do if the invasion comes. So there was all sorts of confusion. And of course, we all know from Band of Brothers and other such things, The Longest Day, great movie back from the early 60s. Especially the American paratroop landings were all confused. We just dropped them all over the place. And that's always been regarded as kind of it was a mistake. It was a problem from the American point of view. from the German point of view, it couldn't have been better if this was planned, because the Germans began getting reports in from all over everywhere of Allied paratroop landings. And of course, the Germans, looking at their maps, they're trying to make sense of what's going on here, and they can't figure it out because there was reports of gunfire and landings all over, which made no sense to them. And so the confusion of the American landings confused the Germans as to what the intentions were, and so that kind of caused a delay. Even here, the problem was not so much Hitler, the problem was the commanders on the spot. The commanders on the spot and Rundstedt in Paris, they early on were notified, and Rundstedt duly mobilized the 12th SS Panzer and the Panzer Lehr divisions, both very, very good German divisions. But in the absence of any confirmed invasion, Rundstedt decided that what was happening here, and again you have the importance of prior experience, Rundstedt decided that what was happening here was kind of like a larger scale dip, that probably this wasn't the major invasion, but probably this was like a diversion, kind of like a big dip. And just as at Dieppe in August of 42, Rundstedt decided that German forces on the spot would be able to handle the situation, so that there was no need to contact Hitler to try to mobilize these other divisions, because there was no need for them, because German units on the spot could handle the situation. Essentially, you have a second problem here, and again, Alan Packwood mentioned that yesterday, and I was very interested when he said that. The German assumption, and it's always the sense that Allied deception measures had deceived the Germans that the major landing was going to be at Calais. To a certain extent, that's true, but it deceived the Germans because essentially it played into the German understanding of what they would do. What German planners would have done, of course, was to launch a diversionary offensive and then allow the enemy troops to rush into this to stop this first offensive, and then they would launch a second offensive behind it to trap the invasion forces. And of course, as Alan had mentioned yesterday, that's exactly what the Allies originally planned. But ours was going to be a little bit different. It was going to be in Normandy and then at southern France. And for a lot of different reasons, as he mentioned, the one in southern France was postponed until mid-August. And as an aside here, I'll point out my father was in the Navy. He was actually he commanded an LCI, a landing craft infantry, landing craft infantry. He actually took part in the invasion of southern France. And since his ship was blown up, he would dispute the fact that it was largely unopposed landing in southern France. But that's neither here nor there, I suppose. So what the Germans anticipated was exactly what the Allies seemed to be doing at Normandy, landing some troops, having a large-scale demonstration, drop some paratroops to cause confusion, force the Germans to send their panzers up, and then the second attack would come at Calais. So it wasn't just Hitler, it was all the top German commanders believed that what they were seeing was what they would do. After all, they made the bold stroke in 1940 in France and won significant victory there. We tend to forget also that this dual prong strategy was also the strategy that the Allies had intended for the invasion of Italy. We focus on Salerno, but the initial invasion of Italy from Sicily was Montgomery's 8th Army, which was supposed to advance up the boot and draw the German forces down, and then the invasion at Salerno would trap the German forces between Montgomery's forces and the Anglo-American forces to the north. So this was not somehow Hitler's being crazy. This is exactly what the Allies had hoped to do at Salerno in Italy. And so it all kind of plays into the German preconceptions here. I'll try to start finishing this here. I know I'm going on and on and on. Essentially, Hitler wakes up. He's notified at the midday briefing. Now they understand that this really is a serious invasion. So, again, rather than hesitate, Hitler authorizes the release of a number of panzer divisions. The problem is that the panzer divisions can't move. It's daylight, and the panzer divisions that are authorized now to move on the beach can't move because they would be devastated by Allied fighter bombers. So even though Hitler now orders these panzer units into action, it's irrelevant because they can't move until dusk. And of course, as we know, early June, those are long days, the longest day of Cornelius Ryan fame. The one panzer division that did get started was the 21st Panzer, although it didn't get started until mid-afternoon. But it managed an attack right down the junction between the British at Sword, I guess, is it Gold? The British and the Canadians. So they managed to attack right down the junction here. You can see the 21st Panzer right there outside of Caen. They managed to attack right down at the junction between British and Canadian forces. They actually managed to reach the beach. And again, that's one of those great what-ifs of history. They managed to reach the beach, so theoretically they could have begun rolling up either to the east or to the west. They could have begun rolling up the beachhead. But what happens is exactly the other part of the German dilemma. Now Allied naval vessels came in close to shore and began blasting away with those big naval guns, and the 21st Panzer lost about 2/3 of their tanks and then began basically to retreat out. So it's a mixed bag. On the opening day, the Allies have made a landing and they've secured the landing, but in Hitler's headquarters there's still surprising optimism. The Allies had not managed to achieve their first day's objectives, let alone a big breakout. Hitler, in fact, as Goebbels recorded, the Führer is in extraordinarily high spirits. The invasion took place exactly at the spot that we had expected, although the propaganda minister also conceded his concern that the Allies had managed to get armored forces, I went too far there, let me go back over here, that had succeeded in getting armored forces ashore. He nonetheless took heart from the fact that 2 first-class panzer units were on the march. Well, they weren't on the march yet. But he reported that Hitler, too, remained convinced that the enemy units that had landed would be evicted and, above all, the paratroops destroyed. The Führer is absolutely certain and shows not the slightest signs of weakness. Hitler told Goebbels, if we repel the divisions, then the war will be completely transformed. He has few worries that this could not succeed. But there's the point, isn't it? It could succeed, but the fact that it could succeed did not mean that it would succeed. And in fact, the initial days, the first few days of the fighting confirmed, obviously, Rommel's notion that the key point to defeating the invasion was to defeat the invaders on the beach. But already, obviously, by the second or third day, that idea was dead. The other idea to concentrate the armored reserves and counterattack, that idea was essentially dying a slow, grinding death over the next few days as it became obvious that the Germans were not going to be able to reinforce their units. The systematic aerial bombing of France, and if you noticed in the recent commemorations in France, Macron of France was very pointedly was very concerned, very determined to point out that something like 20,000 French civilians had died in the Normandy invasion. It's estimated somewhere around 50,000 French civilians probably died in the systematic Allied bombing of France for 2 or 3, 4 months before the invasion, which our bombers systematically destroyed all the roads, bridges, railroad junctions, so forth. The idea was to isolate Normandy to prevent the Germans from being able to reinforce quickly. From the Allied perception, the key to victory was not only a successful initial landing, but the rapid buildup. And if we could build up forces more rapidly than the Germans, then we would win. And that's essentially exactly what happened. The Germans struggled and struggled and struggled to get any sort of reinforcements into the Normandy area. Even the panzer divisions would typically have to detrain about 50 or 60 miles away from Normandy, and then they would have to make the treacherous route up to the battlefield. They arrived in disarray. Many of their accompanying units didn't get there. So it's kind of amazing. Eventually, the Germans managed to assemble, and this always kind of takes my breath away when I think about it. Eventually, the Germans managed to assemble about 12 or 1,300 tanks in Normandy, which is beyond most of our wildest imagination. But they were never able to get those 12 or 1,300 tanks concentrated where they could really launch a major devastating counterattack. So most of the time they were just trickling in, and they were just thrown into battle in kind of makeshift fashion. And in fact, despite what German commanders later on complained of, the biggest single factor of air power in Normandy was probably not on the actual military operations as such. The Germans quickly learned how to take advantage of the bocage and the thick stone farmhouses in Normandy for defensive purposes. The biggest factor of Allied aerial domination was simply preventing the Germans from being able to reinforce. So when the Battle of Normandy turned into a battle of attrition, which it did for 2 months of terrible attrition, the Allies were able to reinforce our troops. The Germans were not. So eventually, sooner or later, the Germans were going to be ground down. And you can see I have here the meeting. You can see Hitler with Rommel and some other generals there. By the 13th or so, it was obvious that the German strategy was failing. Hitler had one final hope. V1 weapons had finally been unleashed on the 16th of June for the first time against London. And June 12th, the first small-scale V1s were kind of small, like cruise missile type things. And they had caused some panic in London. And then on the 16th, there was a much larger V1 raid. So Hitler had hopes that the V1 and then the jet aircraft were just beginning to filter in. So he had some hopes that this might transform the situation. So on the 17th of June, he and Keitel and Jodl flew off to France, to his old military headquarters in France, to meet with Rommel and Rundstedt. Hitler was pale, he was tired, he was seeing his whole strategy dissolve in front of him, so he wasn't all that happy when Rundstedt reported on developments and basically told him, well, the Battle of France was lost. We can't expel the Allies from France any longer. Rommel gets up too. He emphasized the hopelessness of the struggle given the massive material superiority of the Allies. He initially suggested a retreat back into central France. Hitler dismissed that. He had not come to France to talk about retreats. Then Rommel broached an even touchier alternative. Rommel suggested, well, the only way out is some sort of political solution. Well, Hitler was very testy at that one and told Rommel basically, you concern yourself with military matters, I'll take care of the geopolitical strategy myself. So Hitler was bristling. He went back, he flew back that night. He told his entourage that Rommel had lost his nerves. Only optimists, he asserted, can pull off anything today, but of course optimism wasn't enough. The next day, American troops reached the west coast of the Cotentin Peninsula, which effectively isolated Cherbourg, the great port of Cherbourg. The Germans had destroyed Cherbourg, which it would take a month or so at least to put it back into operation, but we now had a major port to supply, so the obvious was simply apparent to everybody. Hitler himself basically understood what the situation was. To finish up here, the German catastrophe resulted from numerous factors. You can see that there was German blundering, the German inefficient German command structure, clever Allied deception operations. The key to me, and I hate to just emphasize the material aspects, but to me the key is simply the sheer raw power of its adversaries. If you study the battle from the German perspective, you're always astonished at the sheer discrepancy in the numbers of troops, weapons, however you want to, whichever metric you want to use. The discrepancy is so enormous that it's in some respects astonishing that the Germans managed to stymie the Allies for 2 months rather than simply collapse immediately. So essentially, whether Hitler slept in or not was irrelevant. He could have slept the rest of the war, and the whole thing would have turned out as it was. So, I thank you, and I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have here. Yep.
Two questions. One, had Rommel been there and not altering his life in Germany, do you think that would have had any impact? Secondly, how effective was the French resistance when they got the code that D-Day was happening and some bridges were blown up and rail lines?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, good questions. It's always one of those what ifs. Rommel certainly would have reacted much more forcefully. There was in the German army at that time, and traditionally in the German army, for officers, especially for senior officers, but officers of all grades, the general dictum was take action. So in the German army, the general assumption was it's better to take action and do the wrong thing than to do nothing. So there's always a bias towards action in the German army. Obviously some leaders have more of the bias than others. Rommel was at the extreme end. So Rommel would have acted immediately and would have set whatever panzer forces he had. It would have caused a lot more consternation, certainly. If you look at it from the Allied point of view, Omaha was a near disaster, and for a long stretch of the day it looked as if Omaha would be a complete disaster. So if not just one German division in the mid-afternoon, but if the 2 or 3 panzer divisions closest to the beach got started early in the day and began advancing down, you can envision, as the Allied planners did, you can envision a ghastly, disastrous scenario in which German panzer units are crashing into the beach. The other one was
the effectiveness of the French resistance.
Oh yeah, the French.
Blowing up bridges.
Yeah, that was the French resistance was very effective. I think it was it Warren in his with the SOE? Did you? Yeah. The SOE. You know more. You know better than me. But the SOE and some of the American OSS and others had been very effective at organizing French resistance up until their organization by the outside forces. From the German perspective, French resistance had not amounted to much of anything. And coming from the German perspective, German soldiers, for example, thought going to France on leave was like going to paradise, especially German soldiers who were transferred from Russia. Every German soldier wanted to be sent to France. There was no particular problem. Despite the myth of the resistance, there was no particular problem for Germans in France. But the SOE and the OSS and others, they did organize then around Normandy pretty effective resistance, blowing up bridges, sabotaging rail lines, attacking German units as they're trying to move forward. So that was effective, yeah.
Yes, if the defense of Normandy had been successful and the U.S. still had a presence in Great Britain, do you think today we would have Soviet Union, German, and then the UK? In other words, Germany would have taken peace and kept Poland and France and
That's always a good question, and my students would ask that question all the time, and I would always ask them, to consider one thing. Down there at Oak Ridge, what were we developing? We tend to forget we used the atomic bomb against the Japanese. The atomic bomb was intended to be delivered on the Germans. Einstein's warning, remember, the warning of Einstein and the other sciences in 1938 was not that the Japanese were developing nuclear weapons or exploring nuclear technology, it was the Germans. The whole Manhattan Project was designed to drop a bomb on Germany. So Germany would have stalemated the war until such time as we had the bombs, and then instead of dropping them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we would have dropped them on Berlin and Nuremberg, who knows, Berlin and the Ruhr. And so that would have been that. So the war might have lasted another year, and then a whole bunch of Germans would have been killed in the atomic bombing. I might be too simplistic here, but I have no doubts that we would have used the atomic bomb on the Germans because that was who it was designed to be used on.
How many tanks make up a Panther division?
That depends. It depends. I don't mean to be evasive, but it depends whether it's early in the war, later in the war, whether it's an SS division, whether it's a normal division. Earlier in the war, it had been 200, roughly 200 tanks. Later in the war, it was down closer to 100, 120. But certain divisions, like the Panzerlehr division, which was a specially developed unit, it was twice the size of a typical German Panzer unit. So a typical German Panzer unit at that time might have 10,000 men, maybe 110, 120 tanks. The Panzerlehr would have 20,000 men and about 220 tanks. And I'll give you an example, a material example of what I mean by firepower. When the Americans broke out at Saint-Lô in late July 1944, finally broke out of the Bocage country, it was Operation Cobra. The great Bradley had conceived this, basically just this massive pulverizing of German lines. So American and British bombers, heavy bombers, B-17s, B-24s, flew down the line. This time we carefully marked it. The British had tried it and had not worked, and the bombs fell as much on the British lines as on our lines. But now about a week and a half later, we did it better with letting the bomb crews know where the lines actually were. So they had lines of B-17s, B-24s come down. Then they had successive waves of P-51, P-47 fighter bombers, just pulverizing the German ranks. The target was the Panzerlehr division. The commander of Panzerlehr was General Fritz, who was a veteran of the Eastern Front. He testified afterwards that he had never experienced in his entire, and he had been in the Eastern Front for 2 or 3 years, he had never experienced in his entire military career anything as savage as what had happened to him. I think it was on July 25th is when the bombing took place. The Panzerlehr division, the men who survived and straggled out, there were only about 10,000, 20,000 of them who survived and straggled out of there, and they only had about 20 tanks left. That's what material superiority did. That was just mammoth. There was a saying in the German army in the old days, sweat saves blood. And I in my original book was a front soldat in the study of the German soldiers, and I was interested in the West, in German diaries and letters. German soldiers began saying with some bitterness, our saying was or is sweat saves blood. The Allied saying is steel saves blood, machinery, equipment saves blood. That got the Germans to thinking, stuff like that. Yeah. Anything else?